We have just talked about the law of marginal utility. Remember that it is the law that explains the value of economic goods. Well, from the standpoint of the individual actor, the other essential law we're going to present now, and which, when the time comes, will help us understand the market process with respect to capital goods, is the law of diminishing marginal returns, or productivity. Notice that in economics we are increasingly going to add on the term marginal, or in the margin. In fact, Austrian economics is also called subjectivist economics, or marginalist economics. We will be discovering together that it is curiously the last actors, the least involved, the last valuations that determine the value of all. It's marvelous and surprising, but it's true. Well, today I'm going to explain the law of diminishing marginal productivity. There are optimal proportions in which to use the factors of production, or higher-order economic goods, to produce what we called first-order economic goods, or consumer goods, those that directly satisfy human needs. I don't like to use graphs, and in fact, I explain economics without using graphs. But occasionally during the year, I make an exception and use one, and I'm going to do that today. I'm going to use a graph and explain the law of diminishing marginal returns or productivity with regard to two factors of production. Since the law tells us there are optimal combinations of productive factors for producing a consumer good, we will suppose there are two factors of production. We'll call one factor of production A, and we'll call the other factor of production B. We'll limit ourselves to two factors to keep the explanation simple. So you can visualize it, we could make factor of production A a natural resource, a plot of land, for example, or a capital good, and then we can study the factors in greater detail. Let's suppose it's a plot of land, and let's suppose, in keeping with the way most economic textbooks present this problem, that factor of production B is the factor the books call labor. There is no such thing as a labor factor. This is a clumsy and extremely misleading simplification. There is no production good that is labor. There is actually an almost infinite array of different factors of production, different types of work. There are workers specialized in teaching. There are managers. There are people who have earned an MBA in the United States or at INSEAD. There are middle managers. There are first, second and third level specialists. There are formwork operators. There are thousands and thousands of factors of production, different jobs. But to keep it simple, we will imagine the labor factor as homogeneous, uniform, the same throughout. And we will suppose that one of our factors is a fixed factor in the sense that its quantity, the quantity available to the acting entrepreneur, does not increase. It is given. So, let's say factor A is the fixed factor, and so we can visualize it, let's say the fixed factor is a plot of land that is going to be farmed. It could be the size of this classroom, for instance. And let's imagine factor B is the variable factor, in the sense that there are a variable number of units available to the actor, the entrepreneur. To put it another way, he or she can employ more or fewer units of that labor factor. A law firm can hire more or fewer lawyers. If I have a car factory, I can hire more or less labor to work on the assembly line. Well, if we suppose factor of production A, the plot of land the size of this rectangular classroom is fixed, what will happen if we start to increase the number of units of the complementary factor? In this case, the labor factor, specifically farmers.
concretamente a agricultores.
We have the plot of land, and we decide, as entrepreneurs, to employ the first unit of variable factor B, of labour, of work, and this might be one worker or an hour of farm labour provided by a farmer who starts working on this plot of land. Since it's a variable factor, the entrepreneur can say, well, I'm not going to hire just one worker, I'm going to hire 2 workers. And why only 2? Actually, even 3 people could work on this plot if it's a vegetable garden. What happens to the final output in the form of consumer goods? Let's suppose the production process is going to mature and yield potatoes. We're going to grow potatoes. Well, what the law tells us is that if we have a fixed factor of production, and we gradually increase the number of units of the variable factor, if we have a fixed factor of production, the plot of land, and we increase the number of workers who farm it, the law tells us that as we increase the number of units of the variable factor, the number of workers, our output of final consumer goods, potatoes, initially rises more than proportionally. One lone worker on that plot doesn't get much done, but as soon as there are 2, the final output of potatoes more than doubles. And if there are 3 workers, it more than triples. This happens for a certain number of additional units of the variable factor. But according to the law, there comes a point when, though the use of additional factor units does result in an increase in the final output of the consumer good, potatoes in our example, it begins to result in a less than proportional increase. On the graph, we see that, though output continues to rise, at some point it begins to rise less than proportionally. To put it another way, each additional unit of the labour factor, variable factor B in our example, results in a smaller additional quantity of consumer goods, potatoes in our example. And that's what the law says. In any production process you can think of, if we suppose there is a fixed factor, the use of additional variable factor units will always, at some point, begin to trigger a smaller rise in additional productivity, in the form of final consumer goods. And that is what is called diminishing marginal productivity. That's why the law is called the law of diminishing marginal returns or productivity. In terms of the graph, when the curve changes from concave to convex, from that point on, from that number of variable factor units, output increases, but it begins to increase less than proportionally. In fact, it would even be conceivable. Imagine the plot is like this room, and we've already hired 50 workers. We start to send in workers, and they get in each other's way, and we send in 100. Hey, 100 of us don't fit in here. It would even be conceivable for the final output of potatoes to suffer and even begin to decrease if we continue sending in people. I'm going to demonstrate to you why the law of diminishing marginal productivity is praxeologically true. Just as the law of marginal utility is usually poorly explained, as if it were a law rooted in psychology or satiety, the law of diminishing marginal productivity is usually poorly explained. In almost all classes and textbooks, the law of diminishing marginal productivity is explained as if it were a technological law. In fact, so that you would grasp and visualize the idea in the example I gave you, even I presented the law as if it were technological in nature. And everyone says, well, what the professor is saying makes a lot of sense. On a given plot of land, in the beginning, there are so few workers that adding more workers makes productivity rise more than proportionally. Then there comes a point when more is still being produced, but an increasingly small amount more. An additional unit, an additional worker, does not produce proportionally the same, but less and less. And, if I understand this visual example the professor has described to us, If we continue to add units of the variable factor, eventually there might even be such disorganization and chaos, such bedlam, that less would be produced. Well, though this approach, paired with a graph, is effective in helping you visualize the idea, it lacks foundation. From the theoretical standpoint, the law of diminishing marginal productivity is not a technological law, the result of workers disturbing each other or not. It is a law that is strictly part of the logic of human action, and that is the main message I want to get across in today's class. In fact, this may be one of the most admirable contributions Mises makes in human action. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something very important. I'm going to show you why the law of diminishing marginal productivity is universally valid. It always holds true. And furthermore, it is part of the logic of human action. And I'm going to demonstrate this a contrario sensu. What would happen if the law of diminishing marginal productivity, or returns, which I have just explained, did not hold true? That is, the law that tells us that there are optimal combinations, that there is a level, a number, a volume of the variable factor, beyond which additional units result in ever smaller increases in consumer goods, diminishing marginal productivity. That's what the law says, nothing more. That beyond a certain volume, the curve must change from concave to convex. What would happen if the law did not hold true? What would happen if there were no optimal combinations of productive factors for generating a consumer good? If the law did not hold true, thus our a contrario sensu demonstration. It would mean that an increase in the units of the variable factor, in our example workers, would still result in a more than proportional increase in the final product. In our example, potatoes. We would keep sending in workers. And what would happen to the output of potatoes if the law of diminishing returns did not hold true? Look where the curve is. I keep going up. I get to the ceiling and go up to the next floor. And I keep sending in workers. The third floor, the fourth floor. I get to the roof and continue up to the heavens. We could achieve any unlimited output of potatoes simply by raising the number of workers.
¿Y esto qué significaría? Respecto del factor fijo.
And what would this mean with respect to the fixed factor? The given factor, the plot of land in our example. It would mean that the plot of land had unlimited productive capacity, and therefore that it was not an economic good, a scarce resource, but a free good. Therefore, with higher order economic goods, factors of production, the law of diminishing marginal productivity must inevitably hold true. And every economic good must by definition be scarce, that is, insufficient to achieve all the ends the actor intends to achieve. If the law did not hold true, that would mean the highest order economic good, or factor of production, considered fixed in the example, whatever it was, would have unlimited productive capacity, and therefore it would cease to be an economic good. It would no longer be scarce. It would be a free good. To put it another way, land, or the factor considered fixed, would be no restriction for any entrepreneur, since it would have unlimited productive capacity, and therefore no one would bother to economize on it. It would have no market price. It would be like the air we breathe, which we take for granted and nobody bothers to economize on, nor allocate shares of private ownership of, nor exchange, because it has unlimited productive capacity. Therefore, inevitably, and inherent in the logic of human action and human nature, and starting from the premise that all economic laws are universally, apodictically valid, and hold true whenever their assumptions are met, if we begin by assuming that both factors of production are limited and scarce, the law of diminishing marginal productivity must inevitably hold true. And we'll leave this law on the back burner for now, because it's very important. Without this law, we could not understand, 2 months from now, how the price of the factors of production is determined. What determines the price of the labor factor of production? Wages. What effects follow from an increase in the population, or an increase in the well-invested capital workers use? The entire theory of capital and the entire theory of the cycle are incomprehensible if we do not understand that the nature of things is such that, From the standpoint of subjective valuation, the law of marginal utility determines the value of economic goods, and the proportions of higher-order economic goods, or complementary factors of production, are subject to the law of diminishing marginal productivity, two basic laws around which our discipline revolves. Let us recall that when we talked about method, we saw how economic science is constructed. To construct it, we begin with the analytically simplest phenomena. The simplest of all is the axiom of human action. Then we gradually introduce assumptions in our chain of logical deductive reasoning, and we arrive at more complex laws. Up to now, I have presented two basic laws on which we are going to construct the entire edifice of the theory of prices: marginal utility and diminishing marginal productivity. One for consumer goods, the other for factors of production. For when we study the theory of prices and factors of production, and now we're going to make an analytical leap to broaden our laws and make them more complex. Until now, we have imagined only one individual, isolated human actor, Robinson Crusoe on his island. To present these two laws, it is not necessary to bring in more people. When we construct economics, we start by supposing there is only one isolated human being, because that is the simplest approach, analytically speaking. We've studied human action, entrepreneurship, its components, the law of marginal utility, and the law of returns. Today, we're going to make a theoretical leap, and we're going to imagine Friday arrives on Robinson Crusoe's island, that there are two of them now, not just one. And why only two? There may be three, four of them. Perhaps a tribe shows up. We're now going to introduce action in the framework of society. We have already defined the concept of society. We saw that society is not anthropological, though it is often personified. An anthropological view of society is often presented. For example, Spain has decided, as if Spain had legs and a mind and made decisions. Or Germany declares war on Poland. It's a manner of speaking. Be careful. We very often commit this error of believing society speaks, thinks, wants, but that's not the way it is. Society is indeed a reality. It exists. It's there, but our mission is to understand what that reality consists of. We are social scientists. We face the biggest challenge. What is society? We've seen that society is an abstract concept. We cannot touch society. Come on, let's touch society, or ask society what it wants. We said that society is a process, and that a process is a dynamic structure comprised of elements. That society is a very complex or extremely complex process, because it is comprised of billions of elements, each of which is a human being, and each human being is a universe unto himself, because he is endowed with an innate creative capacity. We said that it is an extremely complex process, because it contains a huge number of elements. It is extremely complex from a quantitative standpoint, but also from a qualitative standpoint. Because a process, which in a dynamic structure is not only a mass of elements, but consists of interrelated elements. I gave the example of a Meccano set, a structure of different connected parts. As children, we all put together Meccano sets. We built structures with Lego, etc. Well, society is an extremely complex process of human interaction. And these relationships do not involve a physical connection between human beings via a wire, a tube, or a cord. These interactions are also spiritual relationships, which can only be interpreted in historical terms. They are human interactions, basically exchange relationships. Do ut des in Latin. I give you something, and you give me something in return. We make an exchange relationships. These exchange relationships conform to standards of pattern behavior, based on legal and moral principles. Many such relationships, but not all, are reflected in market prices, set in monetary units. We'll see the implications of this because it makes economic calculation possible. It permits us to keep books, to assess whether we've gained or lost with respect to the past, and to make plans and budgets for the future, to guide our action. What drives all of this extremely complex process that is society? What is the force behind society? We've said that it's entrepreneurship. It's the innate capacity of human beings to create information, transmit information, and coordinate. The entrepreneurial process continually creates, transmits, and coordinates. And this entrepreneurial process is competitive in the sense that human beings vie with each other in an attempt to accomplish our ends as soon as possible. And what did we say the result of all this was? Well, it's curious, because this whole mess I've just summed up has not been created by anyone. No ministry organizes it. It wasn't thought up by sages who told us, okay, now you come into the world and start making exchanges among yourselves. It emerged on its own. It's what is called a spontaneous order, which is economists' object of research. In fact, analysis enables us to understand how, when the attempt is made to improve this spontaneous order or achieve specific deliberate objectives in it, it is destroyed. This is the theorem of the impossibility of socialism, which we'll be studying in depth in this class. As social scientists, we discover the spontaneous order, and we are astonished that it has emerged, that it is perfected as it evolves, and that it is expanding without limit. The social, entrepreneurial Big Bang, the constant, limitless expansion of human creativity, knowledge, and information. Though the Big Bang continually generates new maladjustments, it also tends to coordinate previous ones. Furthermore, the great wonder that surprises us social scientists is that though no one has created the spontaneous order, which emerges on its own, it has a curious effect. It fuels life. It permits the sustenance of an ever-increasing number of human beings who live their lives with an ever-increasing richness and variety of nuances in qualitative terms. Thus, as scientists who are analyzing the process from the outside, we realize that the result, unsought by anybody but surprising, is that the process multiplies life. Therefore, society is not a place, nor is it a person. It is an abstract reality, which can only be interpreted if we first have the analytical tools we develop as economists. Society does not think. Society does not decide. The thinking, the deciding, and the acting are done by the elements, the billions of elements that make up the social process. Human beings, the men and women who make up the social process, but not society. It's an illusion. And a very dangerous one, to believe societies exist outside of the individuals who form them and who are capable of acting, because that's not the way it is. It is in statists' interest for human beings to commit the conceptual error of thinking in all-encompassing terms, as if society existed independently. Because statists want human beings to be subject to a superior will, which would be society. And that is in statists' interest, because all of the legitimacy of those who exercise power rests on keeping citizens convinced of the idea that they are, if you will, microscopic elements of a body that thinks and decides outside of them, and to which they must sacrifice themselves. And based on that, we understand the statements, Germany declared war on, or France and England declared war on Germany. Those are lies. Neither France nor England declared war on Germany. Certain specific people, and furthermore a very small minority, made such a declaration and signed a document to that effect. And all the people they sent to the trenches had nothing to do with it. They weren't involved, but they agreed to go based on that conceptual error. But it's all fiction. It does not correspond with reality, but it can have tragic effects if people believe it. It is the mission of social scientists to dispel this myth of the all-encompassing view of society,
omnicomprensivista de la sociedad.
That's why Mises devotes so many pages of human action to debunking holism, or the all-encompassing view of society as if it were an anthropological being that decides, thinks or acts outside of its members.
Al margen de sus miembros. Hay dos leyes.
There are two important laws we must study when we introduce the concept of society. One is traditionally known as the law of the division of labor, and the other is Ricardo's law of association. On the law of the division of labor, let's recall what we've already discussed. I'm not going to go any further than that. To begin with, the name is incorrect. However, it has become thoroughly accepted since the time of Adam Smith, the division of labor. The modern concept of economics requires the name of the law be modified. The law of the division of knowledge, or of information. As we saw, human beings realize entrepreneurially that they benefit if each person specializes in the tasks in which he or she has a comparative advantage. I offered the example of a movie, Jeremiah Johnson. Each person finds an activity in which he has a comparative advantage. And if he specializes in that activity and exchanges the results of his effort for those of the other person, who specializes in a different activity, together they benefit. So there is a horizontal and vertical division of knowledge. And I explained that the division of labor can only increase if it is supported by an ever larger number of human beings. To put it another way, the necessary condition for economic development is a constant increase in the population. Many people have found that surprising. Listen, Professor, it's the other way round. The more of us there are, the poorer we are. No, we can be many and rich, or few and poor. Those are the alternatives. Poverty has never resulted from population growth. Poverty results from socialism, as we will see when the time comes. The thing is, you interpret socialism in political terms. If you prefer, say poverty results from statism. That is, from hindering the spontaneous process of social cooperation. I don't care which party is responsible. There are parties on the right that are far more socialist than those on the left. It makes no difference. They're practically all the same. Why make distinctions? In the 19th century, there was an English economist named David Ricardo, who was descended from a Jewish family that had been expelled from Spain. At the dawn of economic science, this English economist began to theorize about international trade, and he drew the same conclusion we have just drawn regarding interactions between human beings. But he focused on exchanges between different countries, on international trade. Well, his conclusion was that countries benefit if each specializes in the area where it has a comparative advantage. It's just like I was saying before. Human beings benefit if each specializes in the tasks in which he has a comparative advantage, and then exchanges the products of his effort for those of the other person. What is true for individuals is true for nations. It's curious that economists first arrived at this law intuitively in a different sphere, that of international trade. Indeed, Spain has sun, and it produces oranges. But try going to the United Kingdom or Poland. It rains all day long, and it's freezing cold. Or northern Germany. There's no way to grow an orange there. However, the United Kingdom has coal mines, and with the Industrial Revolution, the iron and steel industry emerged, and the country began to produce machinery and capital equipment. Well, Ricardo's theory is, we English people should concentrate on building machines, and the Spanish on making wines, because the sherry is wonderful, as is the port wine, and the oranges are fantastic. So, the cheapest way for Spain to buy machinery is to plant oranges, and the cheapest way for England to get oranges is to build ships. Just think what it would cost to plant oranges in England. A fortune. The English would have to build huge greenhouses, heat them, blow on the clouds so the sun would come out once in a while. An impossible task. And the cheapest way to get machinery and oranges in Switzerland is to build watches. Imagine living in Switzerland. The Swiss can't even come out of the house for 7 months of the year because they're snowed in. Well, if you were stuck in the house, bored, with nothing to do, you might build a little watch. And that explains the advantages of free trade. Everyone comes out ahead. This is simply a rough application to the aggregate of nations of the principles we have already studied in class regarding human interaction between individuals. Now, Ricardo took a step further and asked himself, what happens if a country is more efficient than another in all lines of production? Imagine a country with a comparative advantage in everything. Would it still be worthwhile to make an exchange? Would international trade still be worthwhile? The circumstances we've just considered do not apply. The answer is quite obvious in that case. Spain is more efficient at growing oranges, England at making iron and steel products, and Switzerland at building watches. But what happens if a country is more efficient than another at producing oranges, watches, and iron and steel products? Would an exchange still be in the country's interest? Yes or no? Ricardo concludes that it would, that even in those circumstances, exchanges are worthwhile, that countries benefit if each specializes in the area in which it has the greatest relative, that's the key term, comparative advantage. Though David Ricardo never knew it, Mises referred to the universal version of the law of the division of labor, or of knowledge, as the Ricardian Law of Association, in Ricardo's honor. That explains the title of this section in the textbook, In Human Action. What does it mean to specialize in the area in which one has the greatest relative comparative advantage? Of course, in our hypothesis, we are assuming one country surpasses the rest in all lines, but not necessarily with the same intensity. If one country is overwhelmingly more efficient than the rest in certain lines, in other lines, substantially more efficient, in others, more efficient, and in others, slightly more efficient, Ricardo discovered that it is in that country's interest to devote itself solely to that activity at which it is overwhelmingly more efficient, and leave the other lines to the other countries, and make exchanges. By extrapolation, I give you a very clear example to show what is truly important in human interactions. The example went like this. Suppose a surgeon is 1,000 times better at performing operations than his anaesthetist and nurses. But it turns out he's also the best anaesthetist, though he's only 100 times better at administering anesthetics than his anaesthetist. And also, God's given him the gift, he's a fabulous nurse and assistant. But he's only twice as good at that than the people helping him. The law says it's best for that surgeon to devote himself entirely to performing operations. It's true that the anaesthetist who assists him will not do as good a job as he would if he did it himself, and the nurse who assists him will not do as good a job as he would if he did it himself. But it's no less true that he frees up time by allowing the anaesthetist and the nurse to help him, even though they don't do as good a job. And if he devotes all the time he saves to performing operations, at which his relative advantage is far greater, that is in relative terms, and he makes exchanges with others, everyone comes out ahead. This is a marvelous law, because it tells us why the process of social interaction exists. In other words, it explains why we each have our niche in the process of social cooperation. Even the least gifted, the least educated in terms of scientific knowledge, even disabled people. Everyone comes out ahead in a globalized process of voluntary exchange, in which each person devotes himself to the activity in which he has the greatest relative comparative advantage. I think I offered the example, because I offer it every year, of the TV series LA Law, which was about a law firm. Well, the firm hired an intellectually disabled person as an office assistant to transport the mail from one place to another, and to pass out the coffee. And in fact, he wasn't very skilled at it, but he did it. The president of the firm would have been far more skilled at the job. The president could have done it in 5 minutes. But it is actually of relative importance whether the assistant takes 10 minutes instead of 5 to pass out the coffee, or he delivers the mail all throughout the morning. The president doesn't have to worry about those tasks anymore, and he can devote himself entirely to winning cases. He gives a job to someone who appears to be less capable, but who can then earn a living. The president and the assistant do each other a favor. Both benefit. This is Ricardo's Law of Association, which explains why we are all spontaneously working together in the process of social cooperation, which is society. So, hats off to David Ricardo. By the way, this law is one of the few things, I almost said the only thing, I agree with him on, and hats off to Mises for having developed the law.